need to leave. Now.
What? I'm just having coffee.
Manager says you're making people uncomfortable. You're trespassing.
I bought this coffee 10 minutes ago. I'm not bothering anyone.
Are you leaving or do I need to remove you?
You're making a mistake. FBI, Special
I don't
Agent
care
Monroe.
if you're the president, you're leaving.
Officer Mark Reynolds had been on the Riverton Police Department for 8 years when one morning changed everything. He was 33, steady on the job and confident in his instincts, the kind of officer who trusted his own judgment more than anyone else's. On a busy Tuesday morning, he answered a routine call from a cafe manager about a customer who didn't seem to belong. What happened next? The rapid escalation, the refusal to verify identity, and the arrest in front of a crowded room would destroy careers, force a public reckoning, and cost the city millions. The cafe sat on a corner where office workers and students mixed. The place filled up each morning with people who came to work on laptops, have meetings, or grab coffee before heading to the office. It was the kind of small, bustling spot that made the neighborhood feel alive. At 8:15 on a rainy March morning, the line reached the door and every table was full. The light of the street lamps and the soft hum of conversation made the room feel ordinary and safe. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe. These stories matter, and your support helps us keep them alive. At a small table by the window sat Special Agent Laura Pierce, off duty but preparing for a 9:30 meeting. She had worked in federal law enforcement for 16 years. Her career had taken her through complex cases that demanded careful thinking and strict attention to procedure. She had spent years unraveling fraud schemes, tracking money trails, and following leads across state lines. She had trained younger agents and had been recognized for thorough work and steady judgment. That morning she was dressed plainly: jeans, a blazer, a simple blouse, the look of a professional avoiding attention. Her badge and credentials were in her bag beside her. She was reviewing notes on her laptop, marking questions and refreshing the timeline for a confidential meeting she hoped to close that day. Nothing Laura did that morning suggested trouble. She had paid for her coffee, she had a small pastry beside her cup, and she had been at the table less than 40 minutes. She had not caused a disturbance, and she had not argued with anyone. She was simply taking time to prepare for work. Across the room, the assistant manager, Ethan Cole, noticed her. Ethan was in his mid-20s, energetic and proud of the cafe he managed. He had been trained to keep the place welcoming for regular customers and to remove anyone who lingered too long during the morning rush. He wanted the shop to feel comfortable and safe for patrons who made it their morning routine. But Ethan felt uneasy. A black woman sitting alone with a laptop made him uncomfortable in a space that, in his mind, belonged to a certain regular customer profile. He saw a person who was different from his usual clientele and convinced himself she must not belong. He watched for several minutes, and when his discomfort grew, he called the non-emergency line. He described a person who had been in the cafe for a long time and who was making other customers uncomfortable. When the dispatcher asked if the person was acting threateningly, he hesitated and could not point to any crime. He said only that she had been there too long and he wanted her asked to leave. Officer Mark Reynolds received the call. In his mind, he built a simple narrative. A manager had complained, someone needed to be removed. This was a routine call. He parked and entered the cafe, scanning through the crowd for a figure who looked out of place. When he saw Laura working at the window table, his eyes locked onto what he thought fit the description. He approached without checking the identification Laura offered and without asking any questions beyond the basics. Laura looked up as the officer stood over her. She mentioned where she was headed later and showed the badge tucked in her purse. The badge was the kind that federal agents carry, official, complete with seal and credentials. She asked him to call the agency if he had doubts, but Reynolds had already decided, in that small private loop that forms in a person who trusts their instincts above the facts. He told her she needed to leave. She explained calmly that she was a paying customer and that she had been preparing for a meeting. She held up her credentials again and asked politely and firmly for verification. Instead of pausing, Reynolds persisted. He told her he thought she matched a complaint's description and demanded identification in a voice that carried finality. Laura tried to point out that the appropriate action would be to ask a manager for more information, to look at receipts, to verify residency or identity. She suggested calmly that he call the federal office if he had concerns about the authenticity of her badge. Reynolds dismissed the idea, saying anyone could fake credentials. He began to treat her like a suspect rather than a customer. A second officer arrived shortly after, Officer Daniel Meyer. Rather than reassess the situation, Meyer took Reynolds' lead. The two officers approached as if they were handling a confirmed suspect. Laura continued to identify herself and to show her badge, but the officers' minds had locked into a sequence that filtered out everything that did not serve their conclusion. What followed was an unnecessary escalation, a request to stand up, a demand to move to the door, and then a use of force when Laura hesitated, frightened that the next move could turn violent if she resisted. Witnesses in the cafe began to record on their phones as the officers handled Laura roughly, pulling her arms behind her and snapping on cuffs. People at nearby tables stood up, surprised and alarmed. A woman who had been working on a tablet turned her camera toward the scene. The clanging of the cuffs and the sudden hush that fell across the room made what had been an ordinary morning into something people would not forget. Outside, Laura felt the humiliation as she was led to the patrol car. She had been compliant, careful to assert her rights without provoking the officers, but compliance did not protect her from the officers' rush to judgment. The officers' comments, later recorded by several witnesses, revealed the dangerous loop. The complaint had become proof by assumption, and the badge she held in her hand was treated as a prop rather than a credential. Word spread fast. Within an hour, someone in the cafe had posted the video to a social feed. Clips of the incident circulated quickly. Laura being handcuffed, her calm voice identifying herself as a federal agent, the manager and the officers exchanging terse words. People watched the short clips and reacted with anger, disbelief, and frustration. The footage was clear. An off-duty federal agent had been arrested while sitting in a cafe. That reality made the situation impossible to ignore. Back at the station, the initial confusion turned to concern. When a sergeant viewed the footage and then verified Laura's credentials with the federal office, the facts emerged plainly. The agency confirmed that the badge belonged to an active agent. The officer's account did not match the recorded evidence. Reynolds had not sought verification before detaining Laura, and Meyer had supported a decision that ignored clear identification. The department moved quickly once the video spread. Reynolds was placed on administrative leave. The city began an internal inquiry even as civil rights attorneys offered to represent Laura. The narrative rippled outward. A federal agent arrested in plain view of the public for no good reason, a manager who called police based on discomfort rather than evidence, and officers who acted on assumption rather than procedure. Public reaction was intense. Community groups rallied, local leaders demanded transparency, and national outlets picked up the video. Those who had watched similar scenes before identified broader patterns in the behavior. Calls that start with a complaint from someone who feels uncomfortable around a person of color. Officers who arrive and see only what they expected to see. Escalation that follows almost automatically. The story fit a wider frame. Not an isolated mistake, but a moment that illustrated a structural problem. Ethan, the manager, was fired within a day of the footage spreading. The cafe issued an apology and committed to new policies. Staff would be trained to avoid calling police over discomfort, to ask for proof of wrongdoing before involving law enforcement, and to prioritize inclusion. The city opened a civil rights review, and a federal civil rights division announced its interest in examining the case for potential violations. Internal affairs found that Reynolds had prior complaints on his record. Some were sustained, others unresolved, but a pattern was visible. Repeated allegations that he treated people of color differently during routine encounters. Supervisors had noted concerns, but had not imposed robust corrective measures. In this case, those gaps in oversight became painfully visible. Legal action followed. Laura filed a civil rights lawsuit against the officers in the city, alleging unlawful arrest, racial profiling, and emotional distress. The complaint argued that the officers had ignored clear identification and had acted in a manner inconsistent with training and the Constitution. The city's legal team reviewed the footage, interview transcripts, and dispatch records. The evidence showed that the complaint Ethan made over the phone had relied on vague impressions rather than anything that would give probable cause. The officer's decision to detain without verification was not supported by policy or law. The resolve to settle the case came quickly. Facing damning footage, mounting public pressure, and the legal risk of prolonged litigation, city officials decided a settlement was the most responsible course. A settlement amount was negotiated and announced months later. The city agreed to pay a multi-million-dollar sum to Laura as compensation for the unlawful arrest and the emotional harm she endured. That figure, while large, reflected the seriousness of the violation and the city's desire to address the harm. The settlement also included non-monetary reforms, new training programs, mandatory verification steps in certain non-emergency detentions, and the creation of an independent oversight mechanism to review bias complaints. The consequences extended beyond the officers and the manager. The chief of police resigned amid criticism about the department's handling of bias complaints. Internal policy changes were implemented to require supervisors to review repeated patterns of complaints and to take stronger action when patterns emerge. The city created a public-facing transparency dashboard to display disciplinary actions and complaint outcomes. Civil rights groups praised some of the reforms, but many demanded more systemic change. Laura's experience became a public lesson. She spoke at community meetings and legal forums about the incident, emphasizing that credentials and calm had not protected her and that not every person had the resources to fight back. Her testimony was deliberate and direct. If an experienced federal agent could be handcuffed in plain sight, then ordinary people without badges faced even greater risks. She urged for procedural changes that would prevent similar encounters, explicit verification steps before detaining someone for nonviolent suspected offenses, better training on implicit bias, and stronger supervisory accountability. The broader conversation shifted from just one incident to the system that allowed it. People asked why patterns of complaints had not produced serious discipline earlier, and why officers with multiple allegations remained on patrol. They asked whether managers and employees in private businesses needed training to avoid jumping to conclusions that weaponized police power against customers who looked different. Those questions led to city council hearings, policy proposals, and a renewed push for community oversight. In the months following the settlement, the police department adopted several changes. Officers received expanded training on implicit bias and de-escalation. The department implemented a policy requiring supervisors to verify identity before detaining someone suspected only on vague descriptions, except in cases of immediate danger. A civilian oversight board gained authority to review complaint patterns and recommend discipline. The city also launched community education programs to discourage businesses from calling police unless there was clear evidence of criminal activity. Still, many felt uneasy that more cases had not been prevented earlier. Critics pointed out that the settlement and reforms, while meaningful, did not erase the memory of handcuffs on a woman who had done nothing wrong. They argued that settlements have limits. They compensate harm but do not always change culture. For lasting change, critics said, policies must be enforced and leadership must remain accountable. Laura returned to work and to life with a renewed focus on ensuring others would not be put through the same ordeal. She continued her federal work and used the platform the incident gave her to advocate for practical reforms in policing. Her message was simple: procedures and policies matter, assumptions kill trust, verification prevents injustice. She pushed for better training, for clearer standards on when police should be called, and for external oversight that could intervene when patterns of bias appeared. Ethan, the manager, tried to explain later that he had acted out of a misplaced desire to protect his customers. He said he regretted calling the police and acknowledged that his discomfort came from unconscious biases he needed to confront. The public hearing where he apologized did not undo the damage he had set into motion, and his personal regret could not replace the experience of being handcuffed in front of strangers. For Mark Reynolds, the consequences were severe. He was terminated after an internal review concluded he had violated policy and acted without reasonable cause. His record became a cautionary tale about the cost of relying on assumptions rather than facts. The termination sent a message across the department that unchecked behavior would face consequences, but it also raised questions about how far back supervisors should have acted to prevent such a pattern. The cafe reopened under new management and with a different set of procedures. Employees were trained to handle difficult situations without defaulting to police intervention. The city hosted workshops that included police officers, business owners, and community leaders to discuss how to reduce conflict and avoid calls that could lead to harm. Those conversations were uncomfortable but necessary, forcing people to examine assumptions that had long gone unchallenged. The episode became one of many that entered the national conversation about how everyday decisions, a manager's call, an officer's hunch, a bystander's recording, can reveal systemic problems. Laura's case did not single-handedly fix the system, but it did create pressure for change and prove that public attention, documentation, and legal action could force institutions to confront their failures. The settlement, the reforms, and the public debate that followed left a lasting record. They also made clear that change required continued vigilance. Community groups continued to watch, to collect data, and to demand transparency. Police trainers revised curricula, and civil rights lawyers used the case as a model for teaching about consent, probable cause, and the danger of bias. In quiet moments, Laura thought about the ordinary acts that made her vulnerable that morning. Sitting with a laptop, drinking a coffee, working while waiting for a meeting. She thought about all the people who lacked the protection she had, people who would never see their stories make headlines or result in policy change. It was that thought, not the settlement, not the reforms, not the resignations, that kept her pushing for policy work, community education, and oversight. She wanted the system to change so that others might avoid the same indignities. When asked later if the settlement felt like justice, she answered simply that it felt like accountability. It was proof that a city could recognize a mistake and take steps to correct it. But accountability, she said, needed to be ongoing. Training sessions, policy tweaks, and disciplinary actions mattered only as long as they were enforced and improved. Otherwise, the cycle risked repeating itself. The story of the cafe arrest ended in a legal settlement and new policies, but it did not end the conversation. It became instead part of a longer dialogue about trust, authority, and who gets to decide who belongs in public spaces. For many, the lesson was plain. Small moments of discomfort can turn into life-changing incidents if people in positions of power do not pause, verify, and reflect. For communities committed to fairness, the case served as a reminder that vigilance, documentation, and insistence on procedure can protect people's rights and keep public spaces open to everyone. And in that new light, the ordinary cafe remained a place where people came for coffee, work, and meetings. But now with a sharper awareness that assumptions carry weight and with a renewed sense of responsibility about when to call officials and how officials should act when they respond.